Welcome to Wisped Tales, where true moments of grit and wonder come alive in story form. Today, we're stepping into wind-swept dunes, cluttered bicycle shops, and a stubborn stretch of sky as we follow two brothers who taught the world to fly. Settle in, breathe deep, and let the story carry you. Morning light slid across the windows of a modest bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, painting spokes and chains with thin stripes of gold. Inside, the air held a hum, tools tapping metal, the squeak of leather against a workbench, the gentle tick as a wheel turned itself to a stop. Wilbur Wright, lean and deliberate, measured a chain with almost mathematical calm. Orville, younger by a few years and quick with a grin, relaced a tire and glanced at the front door to see who might wander in for a repair. They'd named their place the Wright Cycle Company, and it was equal parts livelihood and laboratory. To neighbors, it looked like a tidy, honest business. To the brothers, it was a proving ground, where ideas were not daydreams but components, where the impossible could be disassembled, measured, and rebuilt. Their father, Bishop Milton Wright, had taught them to weigh truth carefully and to argue ideas without raising voices. Their mother, Susan, ingenious with tools, had shown them that curiosity wasn't a hobby, it was a responsibility. Dayton, at the turn of the century, was a mix of soot and promise. Streetcars rattled, factories coughed smoke, and the great American century seemed to be cranking itself awake. People biked for sport, for speed, for the sheer rush of a clean, bright day rolling under their wheels. The brothers loved bicycles, the economy of motion, the way a balance point lives between gravity and forward momentum. They knew the feel of a perfect frame before the calipers confirmed it. When Orville took a test ride down West 3rd Street, he could tell if a bike needed 2 turns of a wrench just by the way the handlebars whispered in his palms. But above the shop, above the street, another kind of whisper traveled. Newspapers hawked stories of gliding men in Europe, wings stretched like bats' arms, drifting down slopes with dignity, and then, too often, crumpling at landing. In those clippings, Wilbur saw a map of mistakes waiting to be corrected. He clipped the articles, tucked them into a folder, and wrote to libraries and clubs, asking for obscure pamphlets and German treatises. At night, the brothers read until the oil lamp flickered thin. Cayley, Lilienthal, Chanute, names that built a scaffolding of knowledge around the brothers' belief that human flight was not magic. It was a solvable problem. What made their little shop extraordinary wasn't money or luck. It was the agreement between two minds. Wilbur would stand by a drawing, thumb on chin, and consider the load path through a rib. Orville would lean in, hands ink-stained, and say, "Try a tighter curve. Let's trade weight for strength where it counts." They'd build a small piece, break it carefully, record what failed, and then build again. They were not chasing a spectacle. They were translating a language the air already spoke. On Sunday afternoons, when Dayton slowed to a prayerful hush, they would walk along the Miami River and talk in precise sentences. Wilbur's voice carried a quiet authority, Orville's added spark. Bridge trusses and bird wings entered their sentences like old friends. A swallow would pivot in the air, and both brothers would stop to watch the angle of its tail. "Control," he said softly. "Not just lift, not just power. Control."
One evening, with the shop closed and the smell of machine oil lingering like a memory, Orville unfolded a piece of brown paper and sketched a wing. Wilbur set a paperweight on the corner to keep the drawing flat. "We'll need a place with steady wind," he said, tapping the wingtip. "Not too many trees. Sand would help." He had read about the constant breezes along the Carolina coast. A name stuck: Kitty Hawk, a bare strip of sand and possibility. In the dim upstairs room, the brothers drafted a letter to a weather station near those dunes, asking about winds and seasons. Orville sealed it with the care of a watchmaker. When the envelope left their hands, something shifted. The bicycle shop was still a business, yes, but for the first time it felt like a launch pad. As summer deepened, the brothers' routine sharpened. Repairs in the morning, test rigs after lunch, readings and notes at twilight. Mounting a small wooden airfoil to a homemade balance, they learned how angle changed lift, how even a degree could turn a glide from grace to stall. They built toy kites to test control ideas, twisting their frames to warp the wings, feeling how the air pushed back, how tension in a string could turn into authority over a gust. Their neighbors saw them as polite, industrious, perhaps a bit severe. Few recognized the quiet daring in their days. Yet in the notes they scribbled and the carefully labeled parts stacked against a back wall, an idea was gathering itself to fly not in poetry, not in myth, but in precise footage measured against sand and sky. And in the frictionless agreement between two brothers, the impossible began to look obedient. In Dayton, the lamplighters made their rounds. In the shop, Orville blew out the last flame, leaving the room in soft darkness. Wilbur paused at the threshold, listening to the faint ticking of a wheel slowing down. "Tomorrow," he said. It was not a wish, it was a plan. The reply came with numbers: average wind speeds, seasonal directions, the kind of precise, practical data that made Wilbur's eyes brighten. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, steady winds, open sand, few obstacles. The letter from the local weather observer confirmed what the brothers had hoped. The air there moved like a metronome. Another letter arrived from a resident named Bill Tate, kind in tone and curious in spirit. "You will find a hospitable people and a land with wind enough to test your theories." In Dayton, the brothers held these pages like passports. They laid out the plan on the scarred counter of the bicycle shop. Orville checked the rail timetables and steamship schedules. Wilbur listed materials: muslin, spruce, piano wire, tools wrapped in oiled cloth. They'd ship the crates ahead, trusting freight clerks and patience. Money was not abundant, but thrift was a habit here. Bolts counted twice, canvas purchased by the yard, meals planned to the penny. They had no government contract, no university grant. They had a conviction they did not dress up with theatrics. Control was the key, and control could be learned. In the evenings, the brothers tested wing warping with a kite the size of a door. Wilbur would hold the lines, Orville the frame. With a twist of their wrists, the fabric would flex asymmetrically, one side lifting, the other easing, the kite banking cleanly through an Ohio breeze. A taut line sang. They did not cheer. They recorded the angle, the pressure, the feel, facts, not fireworks.
At the train station, tickets in their pockets, they moved with a calm that felt like ritual. The porter set their trunks aside. Canvas rolls, tin boxes, a stack of journals bound in twine. On the platform, Wilbur watched a flock of starlings wheel and settle on a telegraph wire, each bird correcting its path by a feather's breadth. "Notice the tail," he murmured. Orville nodded, picturing the movable surfaces they would test at the dunes.
The journey east unfurled in clicks and clatters. Through the window, fields greened, then thinned. Towns stitched themselves along the tracks like buttons. Orville kept a small notebook and sketched ideas between station stops. Wilbur read and reread Otto Lilienthal's data, pencil underlining figures that others had accepted with too little skepticism. "We'll confirm them ourselves," he said. Not dismissive, simply exacting. A dining car steward set down coffee. The brothers drank in silence, thinking about forces you could not see but could feel through wood and wire. Norfolk greeted them with brine on the air and gulls arguing over pilings. They moved their freight to a small boat for the final leg and discovered the particular patience coastal life requires. When the tide says wait, you wait. Men in caps and coarse shirts hoisted the crates carefully. "What's inside?" one asked. "A kind of large kite," Orville said, friendly but guarded. Wilbur added, "We're students of the wind." That was true enough. The Outer Banks appeared as a low line between sea and sky. Sand stretched and shrugged, dotted by scrub and tough grass that held fast against salt and weather. There were no grand hotels, no crowded promenades, just the clean arithmetic of horizon and breeze. At Kitty Hawk, Bill Tate met them with a handshake and a smile that said neighbors were rare and therefore valuable. He led them along a sandy path to a place where they could pitch a tent and a small shed, boards hammered together with the sound carrying lightly over dunes. Life there simplified. Mornings began before the sun burned the mist off the sand. Coffee boiled in a dented pot, beans ground by hand, the ritual aligning their focus. They hammered stakes, stretched canvas, and stacked provisions where the wind couldn't steal them. The horizon offered constant instruction, waves marching in even lines, gulls using invisible ramps of lift rising off the dunes, the sky always in motion. The brothers began to speak less and measure more. They assembled their first full glider on sawhorses, the muslin wings taut and pale, ribs curved to a ratio the books promised would work. The craft looked almost delicate, like a dragonfly paused on a reed. Yet beneath the fabric was a geometry they trusted. Spars arranged to share load, bracing wires set to resist twist where twist was not wanted, and a forward horizontal surface, a canard, to test the idea that pitch should be managed up front. Wing warping was their bold thesis, the canard was their bet against sudden stalls. The first hauls up the dunes taught them about weight, how even a few extra ounces placed badly could oppose a whole afternoon's breeze. Orville jogged backward with the glider on his shoulders, Wilbur steadying a wingtip, both reading the air on their faces. They set the machine down on the crest, pointed into the wind, and waited for just the right push. The launch was not dramatic, it was careful.
Reduce noise. Hands released, sand brushed away. Wires hummed as fabric nodded into lift, and then the glider moved forward. Lightning, the skids whispering along the dune's shoulder before settling back with a patient sigh. Locals gathered now and then. Fishermen, their wives, a boy with a dog that loved the sprint of a good chase. They watched without mockery, curious about these polite men from Ohio who did not boast but kept at it, hour after hour, adjusting cables, shifting the pilot's position, testing the canard angle by small degrees. "They don't quit," one man said, as the brothers dragged the glider back uphill for the 10th time, the wind tucking their shirts close against their ribs.
Mistakes announced themselves honestly. A gust grabbed more wing than expected. A skid dug into soft sand. The canard oscillated when set too loose. Each flaw became a line in a notebook. At night, lantern light pooled over pencil sketches as the brothers argued gently about the right cure. Wilbur favored a firmer hand on stability. Orville pushed for responsiveness. The craft should answer a pilot like a bicycle answers a balanced rider. Between them, a compromise emerged that neither felt like compromise at all, just progress. Their tent life was spare but sufficient. A shelf made from driftwood held tins of beans, a loaf wrapped in paper, a coil of wire. Tools hung on nails in a tidy row. When a storm pushed through, the canvas snapped like a drum, and the sand found its way into everything. They had expected hardship and found it manageable. What they had not expected was the joy threaded through the work, the way a successful glide, even short, could make a whole day taste sweeter. Letters traveled back to Dayton and to friends like Octave Chanute in Chicago, the elder statesman of aerial experimenters. The brothers wrote plainly what angles they tried, what surfaces fluttered, where Lilienthal's tables seemed to fail them. Chanute's replies were encouraging, a steady hand from afar. But the real conversation was with the wind itself. Every launch a question, every landing a partial answer. One evening, as the sun sank behind the low scrub and the sky went the color of a cooled ember, Orville walked the ridge alone, his shoes leaving brief signatures the breeze erased. He watched Wilbur from a distance, bent over the glider's nose like a physician at a bedside, listening for where the structure might groan tomorrow. Orville felt something quiet and fierce rise in him, not pride exactly, not yet, but a recognition that they were no longer visiting the idea of flight. They were living inside it. The next morning they would adjust the camber, brace the canard tighter, shift the pilot's position again. They would drag the glider up the dune and let gravity and wind share the work. They would fail neatly, learn honestly, and inch forward. In this place of sand and sky, the brothers had found not just a test field, but a classroom where the chalk was wind and the lesson plan was written in lift and control. They learned to read the dunes as if they were lines on a chalkboard. Each crest carried a lesson, where the wind sheared cleanly, where it curled and tumbled, where a launch would be crisp and where it would be treacherous. Wilbur preferred the slope of Kill Devil Hill, high enough for a generous glide, with a long apron of sand to welcome a decent landing. Orville liked a shorter ridge a few hundred yards down because the wind there had a steadier hand. Between them, they mapped the invisible.
The 1900 machine was a graceful guess, wings broad and curved to match the tables everyone swore by. Wilbur took the first serious glide. He lay prone, hands set to the cradle, shoulders ready to twist the wing-warping cables. Orville steadied the tail and ran a few steps, then let go. The glider lifted, not with drama, but with a firm intention, and slid forward on air like a skater finding smooth ice. Wilbur's shoulders moved and the fabric complied. The left wing eased down, the right came up, the craft yawed a hair more than expected, and then, with a hiss of skids, it settled. 40 yards, maybe 50. Not nothing. Better than rumor. The fishermen clapped once, then folded back into their easy observation, as if to say, "Show us again and we'll believe it twice." They did show it again, all day. By evening, the brothers' arms vibrated from hauling the machine uphill. They'd launch, correct, settle, then climb, adjust, launch again. The canard, mounted out front like a stubborn idea, fought them when it was too loose and punished them when it was too tight. Pitch became a seesaw until they found a stiffer bracing that quieted the oscillations. Their notebooks filled with tidy numbers and small verdicts. Warp authority adequate, yaw coupling notable, Canard brace improved. The words looked dry on the page, the work felt alive in their shoulders and knees. October brought a kink in the weather and a cool insistence to the wind. They learned the sound of a gust a heartbeat before it arrived, a change in the canvas, a different tone in the wire. Orville took a longer glide and felt the craft dip a wing where the dune's lee-side air went thin. His shoulders asked for more warp, the glider obeyed, but the nose also swung, as if the air itself had a hand on the rudder they didn't yet have. He landed cleanly and came up smiling, sand in his teeth. He said, "We're arguing with yaw." He brushed his sleeves. Wilbur nodded, already drawing a little triangle in the margin. Future rudder? ? When storms bullied the camp, they lashed the glider to stakes and slept in their clothes, the tent snapping like a flag of stubbornness. In the morning, they'd dig sand from their toolbox and brew coffee that tasted faintly of salt. Letters home admitted neither hardship nor heroics, only facts. Glides of 300 to 400 feet under 16 to 22 miles per hour wind, control by wing warping promising, lift less than expected from tables. That last line bothered Wilbur more than he let on. The revered numbers from Lilienthal, derived from careful experiments on curved surfaces, seemed to overpromise lift for the area they were carrying. The brothers felt it in their bones every time the machine refused to stay up at an angle that should have been generous. Respect did not require obedience, it required verification. By the time they packed to leave that first season, they had two firm conclusions. Wing warping worked, and the air was telling them the books weren't quite right. Back in Dayton, winter leaned against the shop windows, and they leaned back. They tuned bicycles, paid the rent, and turned evenings into a different kind of fieldwork. A table became a laboratory, smaller wings, tiny balances, a string that tugged at a pointer whenever air pushed. They smiled at how familiar it felt. The same conversation between wood, fabric, and pressure, just scaled to fit a workbench. They returned to the banks in 1901 with a larger glider, bolder span, more area, the confidence of a second season stitched into its seams. The first good day delivered humbling news. Lift still lagged the promise of the tables, and the canard, if set wrong, wagged the machine into a nervous nod. Wilbur took a hard bump that scattered onlookers and bruised his pride more than his body.
That evening, a lantern made a quiet circle of light around two faces set like flint. They weren't discouraged, they were narrowing the problem. Then came a glide that scared them both. In a lively wind, the machine pitched up, stalled, and dropped its nose so abruptly, Wilbur only had time to brace for the abrupt intimacy of sand. The glider survived. The lesson, sharp as a shell's edge, did too. Stability was not a luxury. It was the floor you stood on before you dared anything else. They tightened the canard's geometry and learned to treat pitch like the first violin in an orchestra. If it screeched, the rest of the music would always sound wrong. The locals had started bringing them small courtesies, an extra loaf, a jar of preserves, a bent nail straightened with a laugh. A boy named Eddie took to sprinting their message notes up and down the beach like a postmaster at war with the tide. He'd plant himself on the dune's shoulder and cheer the cleanest landings as if he'd been hired for morale. "You'll do it," he would say, to no one in particular. "You just will." What they did, season after season, was convert awe into arithmetic. They measured angle of attack not by hunch, but by a weighted string against a protractor they'd tacked to the strut. They counted steps along the ground, while a fisherman paced beside them to confirm. They logged wind speed from the station and cross-checked it with how the canvas sang. The pages grew franker. Observed lift, approximately 2/3 of published coefficients. Warping couples into yaw strongly at higher angles. Need independent yaw control. Consider movable vertical surface.
By late summer of 1901, Wilbur had the look of a man who knew the road ahead needed a new kind of vehicle. One afternoon, he stood at the lip of the dune, the horizon flat as a carpenter's level, and said, almost to himself, "We must build the truth ourselves." Orville heard the sentence as a decision. The wind tunnel, something few had attempted with precision, became inevitable the moment the words left Wilbur's mouth. They packed the glider with a care owed to a good teacher and said their courteous goodbyes. On the last walk down the beach, Eddie trotted beside them and asked the question every onlooker nursed, "Will you fly again?" Orville squinted toward the line where the sea stopped pretending it met the sky. "Yes," he said, "but first we'll listen better." He tousled Eddie's hair and promised a postcard. Dayton welcomed them with October smoke and the familiar rattle of streetcars. The shop had its own weather, warm with machine oil, steady with effort. They cleared a corner, scavenged sheet metal, and began to imagine a box where wind could be made honest, numbers could be weighed, and the old tables could be respectfully corrected. In a city that had no dunes, they would build their own sky. On the first night of the tunnel's drawing, Susan's old hand tools, kept like relics, rested on the bench. Wilbur ran a thumb along a plane's wooden body and smiled the smallest smile. Orville lit the lamp, slid a blank page into place, and drew a rectangle that would change the size of their questions. The air would tell the truth. They would make it speak in inches.
They built it from sheet metal, pine, and patience. A waist-high box with a square mouth and a long throat. The kind of contraption that would make most visitors blink and smile politely. To Wilbur and Orville, it was a promise. A place where hunches would be demoted and numbers promoted. They mounted a small fan at one end and a honeycomb of thin wooden cells at the other to straighten the flow. Between those, in the clear working section, they would hang little wings, test articles, Wilbur called them, carved from spruce and sanded until the grain itself seemed to respect the curvature. A balance arm, delicate and clever, translated invisible pushes into measurable deflections. With a pocket scale and a magnifying eye, they'd read lift and drag like a telegraph. The first day the tunnel ran, the shop changed personalities. The bicycle stands waited, patient as furniture, while in the corner a steady wind hissed through the box like a quiet argument. Orville tweaked the fan speed. Wilbur watched the thread tufts they'd taped near the entrance, checking for straightness in the flow. When the threads stood calm, they suspended an airfoil, thin with gentle camber matching the revered tables. Numbers flowed back and refused to flatter. Lift arrived later than promised. Drag insisted on more attention than the books allowed. Orville wrote figures with a pencil sharpened to a needle. Wilbur drew a little skull beside 2 points that behaved badly, a private joke against superstition. Evenings became ritual. They'd eat simple food, sweep the day's sawdust into a neat pile, and then return to the tunnel with new shapes. Thicker sections, thinner, cambers ahead of the spar, cambers behind, blunt noses and sharper ones. Each time the balance arm tipped, a small truth declared itself. They discovered that a slightly thicker wing with a smoother nose earned lift more gracefully and spared them some drag. They tested angles of attack by single degrees and felt the cliff edge of stall move depending on where the curvature lived. The tunnel didn't care about reputation. It rewarded only what worked. They also built a second, more compact balance to measure performance efficiently. two paired surfaces mounted together so they could compare lift-to-drag ratios without recalibrating everything each time. The phrase L/D, lift to drag, took on the gravity of a password. Good wings did more with less. Great wings did it quietly. Those great wings began to reveal themselves. Not the thinnest shapes, not the most dramatic curves, but sections that looked almost modest. In modesty, performance hid. Some nights, Orville would stop the fan, and the shop would feel too quiet, like a room after an argument has been settled. Wilbur would run a finger along a sample's leading edge, eyes abstracted, already drafting the 1902 glider in his mind, a craft shaped by their data, not by anyone else's promises. "The air rewards humility," he said once, almost amused at the thought. Orville laughed. He said, "Good, we've got plenty of that." The tunnel also forced them to rethink their instinct for control. Wing warping had proven itself in the dunes, but its partnership with yaw had been messy. So they tested vertical surfaces, tiny fins and movable rudders, watching how yaw moments played with roll. A pattern emerged. If the rudder could be made to follow the warp, cooperating instead of resisting, the airplane would stop arguing with itself. They sketched a scheme where the pilot's cradle would twist the wings while a set of wires pinned to the same motion would steer the rudder sympathetically. In the tunnel's small empire, the idea behaved like good choreography.
Numbers accumulated, and with them a new confidence, the sober kind that grows from correction, not applause. They recalculated the wing area needed for a human-sized machine, and discovered, with a small jolt, that they could carry less area than last year if the section was right. Less area meant less weight, less drag, less chaos in a gust. They revised the canard's proportions, resolved to stiffen its structure, and penciled a plan for longer skids to forgive rough landings. Every line in the notebook was a refusal to be fooled again. Dayton's winter hummed around them. Snow that melted brown at the curb, chimney smoke that drew straight when the whole town held its breath. Inside the shop, the brothers' breath fogged only briefly before the tunnel's fan warmed the corner. They taught themselves to be happy with slow victories. A 0.5% improvement in LD gained the applause of a grin. A repeatable stall angle earned a second cup of coffee. When the numbers lined up over multiple tests, Wilbur would tap the column lightly, as if to tell the figures, "We see you." By late spring of 1902, the tunnel's great lesson stood like a frame around everything else. Trust only what you can measure, and measure well. The new glider, leaner, wiser, took shape on the sawhorses. Ribs followed the tunnel's best section. Spars accepted gussets where the balances had told them the loads would bite. Cloth stretched with a kind of tautness that sounds like a drum when you flick it. A two-surface vertical tail was drawn up to be adjustable, and, in later fits, steerable with the warp. When they tightened a wire, they were also tightening an idea. Neighbors resumed their curious glances as boxes began to form and tools went into oiled cloth rolls. "Another trip?" a customer asked, lifting his bicycle onto the stand. "Yes," Orville said, swapping a chain with sure fingers. "The wind owes us a few answers." Wilbur chalked a note on the wall near the back door. "Kitty Hawk, August." It felt like writing a promise beside the place you hang your hat. On the morning they shipped the crates, the shop looked temporarily naked. In the emptiness, Wilbur swept the floor with deliberate strokes, and Orville checked the ledger. Rent paid, parts ordered for delivery after their return, a small cushion of cash that would need to stretch like canvas across a long frame. His father visited at dusk, settled his hat on his knees, and listened as they described the new data. He didn't offer advice. He trusted their patience more than he trusted luck. At the door, he said only, "Be exact and be kind to each other." They promised both. When the train took them east again, the brothers looked less like dreamers and more like men running an experiment with an itinerary. They carried fewer assumptions and more tools for finding out. If the dunes were a classroom, the wind tunnel had been a laboratory, and together they had made the brothers fluent in a language only the air could teach. What came next would depend not on bravado, but on whether the 1902 machine would honor the numbers they had coaxed from that wooden box. In the early blue of another Carolina morning, gulls would frame the sky again, and the sand would shape their path up the hill. This time, though, the glider would meet the wind with a new kind of poise, numbers beneath its muslin, a rudder ready to cooperate, and two pilots who had traded belief for understanding. The 1902 glider came out of its crate like a held breath finally released. Sleeker ribs, a wing section born from that stubborn little tunnel in Dayton, and a twin-fin tail that could be tuned like a violin.
On the sand, the frame looked both modest and sure of itself, the way a good tool does when it knows its purpose. Wilbur ran his palm along the leading edge, feeling for snags the eye might miss. Orville checked turnbuckles, then plucked each bracing wire until it sang the same soft note. The wind, busy and impartial, went on with its work above them. They hauled the machine to the shoulder of Kill Devil Hill and paused to listen, not for poetry, but for cues. The hiss in the seagrass, the steady push on their sleeves, the threads tied to the struts that told the truth about swirl and curl. The locals gathered again in small clusters, hats pushed back, hands in pockets, talk trimmed to quiet remarks. Eddie, the fleet-footed boy, stood at the edge of the slope, dog at his heel, as if attendance itself might help. Wilbur took the first glide. He lay prone in the hip cradle, chin forward near the canard, eyes steady on the horizon. Orville steadied the tail, gave a nod, and let go. The glider lifted cleanly and slid out with an authority neither brother had felt before. A breeze teased the right wing. Wilbur's hips moved, warping the fabric, and, as if understanding were a shared secret, the rudder answered in sympathetic motion. The yaw that had haunted last year's craft melted away. The machine banked, not dramatically, but decisively, choosing its own line across the face of the dune. Wilbur settled it to sand with a tidy sigh and a wake of dust. He stood, brushed grit from his sleeves, and looked up to where Orville was jogging down, grinning. "Did you feel it?" Orville called. Wilbur nodded once, his version of a cheer. "It minded," he said. "At last it minded." The fishermen clapped, their palms loud in the salt air. Eddie whooped. The dog agreed with a bark that bounced off the slope. Repetition confirmed what the first glide had promised. Orville took longer runs, exploring edges the wind had kept hidden until now. Shallow banks, then steeper. Small corrections, then brisker ones. Testing whether the rudder would keep pace as angles grew bolder. The canard, stiffened and properly braced, stopped chattering and began to behave like a thoughtful partner. When Orville nudged the nose down to gather speed, the craft complied. When he eased it back, it held without that nervous oscillation that had written so many unwanted signatures in the sand last year. They learned the hill the way a violinist learns a concert hall. There was a sweet spot 3/4 down the long face where the wind, lifting and sliding, gave them a longer handoff. They marked it in their notes, not with sentiment, but with coordinates. The dune's shoulder, distance from a bleached post, pace counts from a scrub bush that refused to move no matter how the weather scolded it. Good air had landmarks, if you paid attention. A day came when the breeze built from amiable to athletic,
and the glider turned, at last, from a cautious student into something like a teacher. Wilbur launched, found the slot of lift, and rode it farther than either had managed, hundreds of feet along the slope, then further, the machine answering with the poise of a well-balanced bicycle. He eased left, the rudder nodded with the warp, the nose held steady, and the craft slid across the skyline like a blade on clean ice. When he landed, he didn't smile. He laughed, a low, surprised sound that made Orville laugh too. The locals, unpaid ushers to a show they hadn't bought tickets for, let out an honest cheer. With control came duty. The brothers refused to be drunk on a single day's success. They tuned, they tested, they tried extremes.
How hard could they bank before the inner wing complained? How tight a correction would the rudder tolerate before it tugged the nose too far? They experimented with pilot position, shifting weight fore and aft to learn how the center of gravity spoke to the canard's leverage. Twice a gust put them in a tangle that tested ribs and tempers. Twice they stood up, examined the joints, and adjusted with a surgeon's calm. They added small tabs to the rudder linkage to even out the feel through the hip cradle. Orville proposed a subtle change in cable routing to soften the first bite of yaw, making the response progressive rather than abrupt. Wilbur agreed, and the next glide felt like handwriting had improved. Same letters, cleaner script. Notes in the ledger grew confident enough to leave breadcrumbs for future engineers. Coordinated turns achieved with warp rudder coupling, adverse yaw mitigated. They didn't write it to impress anyone, they wrote it so tomorrow's version of themselves wouldn't have to rediscover what today had cost. A traveling newspaperman stumbled onto the dunes one afternoon, and seeing the glider slide long and true, asked the obvious, "Will you put a motor on it?" Wilbur met the question with a politeness that kept secrets safe. "Power without control is a splendid way to reach a bad landing sooner," he said. The man scribbled anyway, as if good sentences could substitute for good air. The brothers returned to their work. The only interview that mattered was the one they had with the wind. In the blue hours after sunset, they wired lanterns to tent poles and reviewed the day. Sand rasped in every hinge. Coffee tasted like victory and salt. Eddie sat cross-legged with the dog asleep across his shins and listened as if he were hearing chapters of a book before it was bound. "How far today?" he asked carefully, like a boy who knew numbers mattered. 400 and some, Orville answered, then corrected himself after checking the page. More. He tapped the column and smiled at the arithmetic of it. The season matured, and with it, the brothers' patience sharpened into something that looked from the outside like inevitability. They performed figure eights, controlled, repeatable, the glider obedient through the whole pattern. Not circles of bravado, but signatures of control. The ink laid down evenly from start to finish. A fisherman who had watched them for 2 years folded his arms and said to no one, "These men will fly with a motor, and it'll look like they meant to." By the time they created the glider for the trip home, the sand carried a diary of skids and arcs only the sky could read. The brothers, tired in bones and bright in eyes, knew a threshold had been crossed. The 1902 machine had not just glided, it had been steered, persuaded even, to draw lines of their choosing. Control was no longer a wish, it was a craft skill, repeatable, teachable, the kind of thing you could build a future on. On the last evening, dusk painted the dunes a color that had no name, somewhere between ash and lavender. Wilbur climbed the hill one more time and looked out at the ocean's careful breathing. Orville stood beside him, silent. They did not talk about engines or propellers, not aloud, but the shape of next year stood with them in the wind. A frame a little stouter, a chain run from a homemade motor, twin propellers carving the air with numbers, not hopes. They would take the language of control they'd earned and add a new verb, sustain.
They walked down in the dark, found the lantern's yellow circle, and wrote the last lines of the season's ledger. The page did not say miracle. It said, "Control secured. Return to Dayton. Prepare power plant."
The hill kept their footsteps. The wind erased them. The lesson remained. Back in Dayton, the cold had a way of polishing ambition. Streetcars chimed at intersections. Chimneys drew straight when the air stilled. And in the rear of the bicycle shop, two brothers measured a room not by its walls, but by the problems it could contain. Control, earned. Next, sustain. If the glider could be persuaded to choose its line, then a motor could be asked to keep it there, provided the motor was light enough not to sink the promise and strong enough not to flatter it. They started with letters and catalogs, then with disappointment. Automobile engines were heavy, indifferent brutes. Marine engines were honest but slow, and none of them cared about weight the way a wing cares. "We need power without poundage," Wilbur said, tapping a pencil against the ledger. Orville did the math again. Horsepower to weight ratios, propulsive efficiency fantasies rubbed thin by real numbers. The columns refused to bend to what the market offered. So, they did what the Wrights always did when a store-bought answer wouldn't mind. They decided to make one. Charlie Taylor, the shop's quiet machinist, with sure hands and a mustache that made him look like the trustworthy half of a handshake, pulled his apron tight and set a blank of aluminum on the bench. He knew metal the way a violinist knows an A, a tone in the fingertips. Orville sketched a 4-cylinder inline arrangement with water jackets and a flathead simplicity meant for service, not show. Cast aluminum for the crankcase would save weight, if they could pour and machine it without turning the thing into an expensive colander. Steel where steel belonged, bronze where friction threatened pride, oil channels that remembered to be generous. It wasn't a design to impress dinner guests. It was a plan to make the air do useful work. The shop changed its music. Where spokes once ticked, the lathe now sang. Charlie trued a crankshaft that wanted to be obstinate, coaxed piston rings into a fit that wouldn't gall when heat rose, and machined valves with faces clean enough to hold compression like a promise. The first time they set the head and torqued the studs, the engine looked like it might belong to the future, compact, purposeful, a contradiction to everyone who said you couldn't have power without lugging around a cast-iron conscience. Evenings found Wilbur with paper, not for prose, but for propellers. Here, the catalogs were worse than useless. Ship screws bullied water. Air was a different animal. The brothers refused to staple a maritime idea onto a sky problem. Instead, they turned the question inside out. A propeller isn't a screw so much as a rotating wing, a series of small airfoils marching in a circle, each with its own angle of attack and airspeed determined by radius. That thought, that a propeller is a wing traveling in a helix, opened the door. They drew sections at different radii, calculated pitch and twist so each ring of the blade would do its share and no more. No handbook applauded. The numbers either closed or they didn't. These did. They carved the blades from laminated spruce, gluing thin boards with the grain set to disagree helpfully with stress. Orville shaped the leading edges until they felt right under his thumb, neither knife-thin nor club-blunt, but the sort of curve the tunnel had taught them to trust. They built a test stand in the yard behind the shop and bolted everything down until the earth itself seemed to be part of the fixture.
When the engine coughed into life, first with a stubbornness that insulted their patience, then with a rhythm that sounded like agreement, the propellers turned the afternoon into a flicker of light and shadow. A scrap of ribbon tied to a fence post leaned steadily back as if listening. Numbers first, always.
They measured thrust with a spring balance fat enough not to be fooled, reading pounds while the engine barked and the propellers wrote invisible spirals in the air. What they saw surprised them: efficiencies that belonged more to theory than to luck, power that shook the timbers without breaking them, weight numbers that kept the dream in the green. "We can carry it," Orville said, and the sentence landed like a signature at the bottom of a long contract. There were setbacks, honest ones. A fuel line leaked its complaint, a bearing heated until it scolded them into a redesign, a propeller lamination split in a way that turned their stomachs and taught them to be stingier with moisture in the glue. Charlie rebored a cylinder with the calm of a surgeon who schedules miracles between lunch and closing time. The second set of blades came off the bench better than the first: tighter grain, smarter varnish, a twist profile trimmed to match the math instead of what the eye wanted to see. On the test stand, the pair of propellers, counter-rotating to cancel the torque that would try to twist a pilot's day out of shape, made the fence boards hum an involuntary harmony. Meanwhile, the airframe on the sawhorses evolved from the 1902 lineage without apologizing for its added muscle. Longer span, broader chord where lift would buy them margin, bracing trusses in the bays that remembered what dynamic loads could do to a proud, thin spar. The canard up front kept its job description: quiet the pitch, mind the angle, while the twin tails aft learned to stay in step with everything else. Chain drives would shuttle power from the engine to the propeller shafts. The sprockets, borrowed from bicycle thinking and then made sterner, would have to run true or else the airframe would hear about it during an already busy moment. A curious visitor asked why 2 propellers. Orville pointed to the chalkboard where torque arrows would have tormented a single rotation system and smiled at the geometry that had silenced an argument before it began. Wilbur added, 2 smaller discs can be gentler to the frame than one ambitious one, and left it there. They measured chain tension with a musician's ear, counted links twice, and safety-wired everything that had ever even thought about loosening itself. When spring softened into early summer, the shop was a parliament of parts ready to argue their case on a beach far away. Crates appeared like small houses, straw for cushioning, oiled cloth for protection, a choreography of packing that would have made a quartermaster proud. Bishop Wright visited again, said nothing about risk because he knew the boys kept a tidy ledger with fate, and then, on leaving, pressed a small Bible into Wilbur's hands, for camp reading, which in their family meant for comfort, not for show. On the last night before shipment, the brothers stayed late. The engine, cool and silent now, sat like a promise in its crate, the propellers wrapped and labeled as if they were violins. Wilbur closed the lid on the box of tools with the same care he might have used for a letter to a friend. Orville chalked a final list on the wall: spare chains, spare plugs, spare nerves. Charlie leaned on the doorway, wiping his hands, and accepted his role in the next chapter with a nod. He would stay in Dayton and keep the shop honest. The brothers would carry the shop's best thinking to the dunes. Outside, the street lamp cast a pool of light that barely reached the curb. Inside, in the hush that comes when a place has given you all that can for the day, the brothers stood a moment longer. They weren't braver than anyone else. They were simply exact. Tomorrow, trains and ships. Soon, sand and wind. And then, if the numbers were loyal, and the wood remembered what it had promised under the plane and knife, something new. Not a glide that visited flight, but a flight that decided to stay a while. They locked the door. The shop exhaled. Dayton slept. The future, created carefully, began its journey east. The Outer Banks greeted them with the same spare grammar: sky, sand, wind. No decorations. Their camp from last season stood where they'd left its bones, a shed with boards silvered by salt, a tent ridgeline that remembered the right height, and the dune's long back curving toward the ocean like a shoulder they trusted. The crates arrived after them, tar-streaked from rail cars and deck spray, but sound. Eddie, taller now and newly proud of it, ran circles around the stack like a dog around a wagon, asking questions between breaths. The fishermen waved from a distance, their nods saying, "We were expecting you even if we didn't know when." They unpacked with a ritual steadiness. The airframe came first, spars and ribs like the grammar of a sentence they had practiced until it felt native. Then the engine, heavier than it looked when you were carrying it, lighter than it had any right to be when you set it on the bench and remembered what it promised. The twin propeller shafts gleamed like intentions. The laminated blades, wrapped in canvas and varnish smell, waited. The first week belonged to assembly. Wilbur and Orville moved around the frame like two carpenters finishing a house they planned to live in. Turnbuckles took their set. Bracing wires found their exact pitch. The canard's pivots turned free, but not loose. They bolted the engine to its bearers and ran the chain lines with the care of tailors threading silk through a narrow eye. Every link was a future sentence, and none of those sentences could be allowed to shout at the frame. When they finally swung the propellers into place, the machine looked less like a glider with ambitions and more like a new species that had never needed to apologize for itself. 2 discs of air would be carved here, counter-rotating to cancel the torque that would otherwise lean a pilot into trouble. Eddie stood with his mouth open, hat in his hands. "Looks real," he said, surprised to hear the word as it came out. Wilbur smiled without showing teeth. "That's the idea." They tested without bravado. First, a hand on each blade, rocking them to listen for bearing truth. Then fuel in the tank, a careful prime, and a rope wound around the flywheel the way a boatman starts a temperamental motor when a fish won't forgive a delay. Orville pulled, the engine coughed as if clearing its throat. Charlie Taylor was not there to fuss the mixture, so the brothers did it themselves. Tiny adjustments, half-turns that learned the local air. The engine settled into a beat that put a tremor in the props and a hum in the shed wall. A ribbon tied to a post leaned back and held. A scale anchored to a sled read pounds that meant thrust. They shut it down before it could heat past their caution and wrote the day's arithmetic.
The second test gave them a listen with teeth. A chain spat itself off a sprocket, snapping forward like a snake and scoring a prop shaft guard with an angry kiss. The engine clattered to silence, the dog bolted, Eddie swore softly, imitating a grown-up he admired. The brothers examined the damage, not with alarm, but with respect. The alignment was close. Close would not do. Orville proposed a hair's breadth shim under one bearer to bring the shafts into better conversation. Wilbur adjusted chain tension by links, not by wish. They replaced the chain with a fresh run, checked for stretch, and promised each other they'd stop the day at the first hint of heat or complaint. Wind, their old collaborator, did not always keep office hours. Days came gray and sulking, the air slack as a sheet on a clothesline. Others arrived like a stern teacher, gusts too jumpy to trust on a first attempt at power. They waited. They ran the machine on the ground to listen for small wrongs, an unfamiliar ticking, a resonance near a strut, and chased each with a spanner and a pencil note. The locals teased them kindly. "You boys gonna fly that house or keep it as a music box?" one fisherman asked. Orville tipped his cap. "A well-tuned instrument plays longer," he said. On a day with the right sort of wind, they dragged the machine onto the sand and laid a rail, 2x4s topped by a strip of metal to turn friction into a mere suggestion.
The flyer's skids would nest on a small dolly that could roll straight and then mind its own business after takeoff. Wilbur walked the length of the rail slowly, checking for a proud nail, a warp, a betrayal. The rail was a promise. The first 50 feet would be straight and true if the pilot did his part. They drew lots, as fairly as brothers could. A coin turned and landed on responsibility. Wilbur first. He lay prone on the lower wing, hands at the hip cradle, chest near the engine's heartbeat. Orville took his place at the wing to steady it against cross gusts. Eddie stood back, eyes wide, trying to hold his breath and failing. The engine started, the propeller's blur thickened, and the machine tugged at its tether with a hunger that felt like purpose. Wilbur signaled, the tether released, and the flyer rushed the rail like a runner leaving the blocks. Then the nose bit up just a whisper more than it should have. The canard asked for a correction. The wind, opportunist that it is, offered a small slap. The flyer skipped the rail's edge, bumped and kissed the ground with a rudeness that turned a small fitting into a scolded shard. Silence came hard and quick. Orville jogged in, kneeling at the canard, hands already knowing which bolt would have to be remade. Wilbur stood, brushed grit from his cheek, and shook his head, not to refuse the day, only to file its result. Over-rotation on takeoff, canard more delicate than theory had hoped. They hauled the flyer back to the shed, mended what pride and spruce demanded, and sharpened their plan. The next trials were humbler and smarter. Taxi runs, they called them, though there was no paved avenue or polite terminal to justify the term. Power up, hold straight, let the skids kiss the rail and the dolly roll, then power down before the canard's leverage turned a practice into a problem. They learned how the rudder nibbled at yaw during that first shiver of speed, how the warp wanted a whisper of input as the wings began to believe they could carry their share.
Reduce noise. Eddie started calling out true or left a hair. His voice pitched to a sand-swept metronome, and the brothers corrected like a team that knew which hand which job belonged to. Evenings, the shed turned into a schoolhouse again. Wilbur would sit on an upturned crate and redraw the first seconds of takeoff until the pencil looked like it might wear through the paper. Angle of rail, expected wind, the canard's trim, the hip cradle's first movement. Orville calculated what a slightly longer rail might buy them in calm days, and what a pound less in the pilot's coat might spare the motor. "We can trim the nose moment with a washer here," he said, tapping the canard pivot. "Let the pilot start neutral, not already bidding for climb." They adjusted, and then wrote the adjustments down like men who expected to be believed later. The weather played its tricks. A day of rain turned the sand to a heavier grade of resistance and the tent into a drum. Another slammed in with gusts that made canvas crack like a whip and sent the dog under the shed in a dignified panic. They used those days to fix everything that wasn't quite wrong yet. Safety wire fresh, varnish a new coat, a dab of graphite where wood touched wood with the wrong kind of friendship. The flyer waited, patient as a tool on a bench, knowing its job and not insulted by delay. One afternoon, Bishop Wright arrived, his coat catching sand in the seams. He took a long look at the machine, not like a spectator, but like a father who had learned to let his sons show their work, before he said, "I see." He read their faces first, then the ledger. "You have done your best," he said, quietly. It wasn't a blessing in the religious sense. It was a verdict on the only thing the brothers truly controlled, the quality of their attention. As November leaned toward its colder half, the camp's rhythms tightened. Fuel drums stood in a neat row. The rail moved to the firmest ground they could find.
The shed floor swept before they rolled the flyer out, as if respect for small order might impress the larger forces. Locals began to visit with the air of men who had told their neighbors, "Come see," and had taken the risk of being early to a story. Eddie's dog learned to sit by the second tent pole and not move until the engine stopped. Even animals can be taught reverence. On a morning washed clean by night wind, with a sky that promised no mischief, they decided. No demonstration, no crowd call, just the three of them, and the sea that had agreed to witness 1,000 quiet attempts already. Orville checked the rail. Wilbur checked the canard. Eddie stood poised to fetch what fell and to shout what mattered. The engine started clean. The props blurred into the kind of commitment you can feel on your skin. Wilbur looked down the rail, not into a myth, but into the length of metal he knew and the next 10 seconds he could influence. The day held its breath. The morning came spare and honest, the kind of cold that tidies your thoughts. Frost stitched the dune grass. The ocean breathed like a metronome. They had tried a few days earlier, Wilbur at the controls, only to have the flyer leap too eagerly, stall, and settle in a bruised heap that scolded their optimism but spared their nerve. They'd repaired the canard spar, trued the rail, and read their own notes aloud until memory and intention matched. No speeches, no ceremony, just work in the right order.
They rolled the flyer to the start of the rail and set the small dolly beneath the skids. The machine looked as if it had always been waiting for this sort of morning. Fabric tight as a drum, twin props ready to carve two precise arguments into the air. A handful of men from the life-saving station stood at a distance, caps in their fists, faces soft with curiosity. One of them, a quiet fellow named John Daniels, agreed to squeeze the rubber bulb on a box camera when the moment asked. Eddie hovered beside the shed, dog at his heel, trying to learn stillness from the men. They drew lots again, and this time the coin gave the first attempt to Orville. He nodded, not with bravado, but with a kind of relieved acceptance, like a student who'd been called upon to recite a passage he'd practiced 100 times. He lay prone, hands braced, hip cradle ready to talk to the wings and rudder. Wilbur jogged alongside to steady the right wing until the flyer had earned the right to handle its own balance. The engine answered the crank with a cough, then a rhythm that steadied. The props turned the morning into a flicker. Orville glanced down the rail, felt the wind on his cheek, and set the canard to a neutral he trusted. "Ready," he called, and the tether released. The flyer slid, then rushed, then found the thin place where friction loosened its grip. The nose wanted to rise, every part of the machine eager to declare itself airborne. Orville corrected with a small, practiced hand. "Don't climb faster than your understanding." The skids left the dolly, and air, at last, agreed to carry more than fabric and intention. 12 seconds, 120 feet. The numbers were small as numbers go, and they were everything. The craft bumped back to sand with the gracelessness of a colt, but upright and unashamed. Wilbur ran in, grabbed the spar and whooped, a short, astonished sound that a careful man allows himself once in a decade. Orville sat up, cheeks raw from cold and wind, eyes bright. John Daniels blinked, arms still lifted from the camera squeeze, as if the act of recording it had briefly handcuffed his disbelief. Eddie forgot how to breathe, then remembered and laughed until the dog barked at the shape of joy. They set the flyer right, checked the joints, retightened a wire that had slacked its manners, and wrote the distance and duration as if bookkeeping could make the sky accountable. The wind held steady, an honest partner. Wilbur took the second run. Longer, farther along the beach, the line a little truer.
Orville took the third, steadier still, the nose less jumpy, the canard's voice more companion than critic. Each landing printed a set of skids across the beach like underlines drawn with a carpenter's pencil. The fourth attempt felt like a chapter choosing its own last sentence. Wilbur at the cradle, jaw set, not in stubbornness, but in concentration. The flyer rushed the rail, lifted and held. A straight line that became a paragraph, then a page. 200 yards, then more. 59 seconds of air carried on purpose, with corrections you could see and trust. The lifesavers shouted in a way the sea accepted without offense. The brothers did not dance. They walked the distance, touched the spot where the skid settled, and let the numbers take their rightful place in ink. 852 feet, 59 seconds. There was nothing theatrical in the handwriting, and everything new. They turned the flyer around for more, hungry in the disciplined way of craftsmen. The wind, perhaps tired of being such a generous witness, decided to add a marginal joke.
Reduce noise. A gust shouldered the machine during a ground move, and before two men could shove back against an invisible hand, the flyer rolled and cracked. Spars, offended, made their feelings known in broken fibers. The day, which had given more than anyone could have reasonably asked, ended itself with a clean finality. They would mend, of course, but not today. They carried the pieces to the shed with the solemnity of men who understood exactly what they had done. Not luck, not a stunt, not a prank on gravity. A machine had flown under control, sustained by power, guided by a pilot who asked for what he wanted and received it. The difference between last year and this day was the difference between a rumor and a fact. Back in camp, the stove did its competent little work. Coffee steamed. Hands shook, more from cold than nerves, but not entirely. Wilbur wrote a telegram home with adjectives kept on a short leash. Success 4 flights Thursday morning. Then distances, durations, and the sort of details a father would understand and a nation would, in time, learn to repeat. Orville read the message once, nodded, and handed it to the lifesavers who would see it to the wire. That night, the ocean beat its steady drum, and the tent snapped like a satisfied flag. Eddie lay awake longer than he meant to, imagining a day when a flight like that would be routine enough to earn a yawn. The dog snored as if already living in that future. In the shed, the flyer rested as if machines could sleep, its fabric scuffed, its frame offended in a few places, its promise intact. The brothers slept light and woke early. There would be repairs, there would be arguments with weather, and there would be the long work of proving that today had not been a fluke. But some thresholds once crossed refused to be uncrossed. 12 seconds had been enough to tilt the world. The telegram hustled ahead of them, lean and unsentimental. And by the time the brothers packed the cracked flyer for the journey home, a rumor had already taken the train north. Newspapers toyed with the story the way a cat toys with a new noise. Some printed it as a curiosity, placing it near items about winter storms and a minister's resignation. Others cocked an eyebrow. Ohio brothers claim powered flight, some said, as if the words might evaporate by morning. Skepticism wasn't cruel. It was simply the common sense of a century that had been handed too many patent medicine miracles. Prove it, the world said. Prove it again. Prove it where we can see. Dayton received them with the sound of carriage wheels on hard streets and the gentle astonishment of neighbors who knew what the brothers were capable of making with their hands. But flying? Bishop Wright read the wire again, then read their faces, and any questions he might have had fell into the quiet space where trust sits. Catherine, their sister, sharp-eyed, equal parts warmth and steel, hugged them both, and then pointed to the parlor rug
as if she were drawing a chalk line on a workshop floor. "Explain it here," she said, "so I can explain it to everyone else." They did, simply. A rail, a dolly, a canard that minded, a motor that didn't weigh like guilt, and 4 flights that would survive anyone's ledger. Catherine listened like a juror who took notes. "All right," she decided. "Now you'll have to do it where the town can hear about it between the washing and supper."
Kitty Hawk had given them cooperation and privacy. Dayton would give them scrutiny and winter. The question wasn't whether the flyer could fly, it was whether a version of it could be assembled and improved on a patch of land near home, with curious eyes peeking over fences and wind that remembered it owed nobody any favors. They bought the next chapter with a handshake and a small fee, a wide, rough field east of town where cattle grazed reluctantly between the tracks of the interurban, Huffman Prairie, as open and unromantic as a ledger page. They dragged a new machine out to the prairie in 1904, still learning how to translate a beach habit into an inland dialect. Without the bank's obliging winds, the flyer, too, stiffened here, lengthened there, needed a longer run to unstick itself from the ground. The rail helped, but calm days mocked them. A straight-line sprint across lumpy grass taught them that good intentions are heavier than they look. "We need a head start," Orville said, squinting into lazy air. Wilbur stared at a timber pile near the fence line and measured it with the sort of attention he usually reserved for ribs and spars. The catapult was not elegant to look at. A wooden tower, a weight hung from its top like a grandfather clock with ambitions, a rope routed through pulleys to yank the machine forward when gravity did its honest part. But when the weight fell, the flyer learned to hustle, rail or no, and airspeed arrived even on days when the prairie sulked. The first time they tried it, the tower creaked, the rope sang, the flyer leapt, and for a few seconds the field looked like a friendly, level argument they might win. They did not string pearls of triumph along that summer. They tied knots of progress. A stronger spar after a hard landing rode its case in splinters. A richer mixture kept the motor from leaning out like a man who'd skipped breakfast. A trim tweak on the canard quieted an eagerness to porpoise at the wrong moment. When they bent something, they repaired it with a shrug and a finer judgment. When they scared themselves, they took a day and invented a fix that promised to make the next scare less likely. "A machine is what it forgives," Wilbur said once, half to Catherine, who had come to the field with a basket and the kind of calm that makes men remember to breathe. Reporters visited with faults in their patience. They wanted spectacles, not sequences. The Wrights gave them sequences anyway, short hops, then longer runs that curved at the edges, as if the machine were discovering it could turn without asking permission from the earth. Men penciled in notebooks and went home unsure of how to sell a story made of glides that became more. The Wrights weren't shy, they were precise, and precision is a poor dinner guest when the table is set for fireworks. By autumn, Flyer 3 begat itself out of Flyer 2's bruises. Longer span, a rethought control linkage that asked less of hips and more of leverage, and structural grace born of pain. The catapult tower grew surer under their hands. The prairie learned the weight of the falling box like a metronome remembers a tempo. Orville, at the cradle, took off and held the line with an ease that would have made the dunes proud. He did a slow, honest circle, then another. The machine came back to a point near where it started because the pilot had asked it to, not because the wind had herded it there. "Circles," Catherine said, hugging herself against the breeze. She was right. A circle says control in a dialect even skeptics admit they can hear.
A few farmers left their fence mending to watch the turns with mouths slightly open. The interurban car slowed sometimes, as if a motorman were telling his passengers, without words, to look out the window where something sensible was happening. Not a miracle, a craft.
The notebook's numbers fattened. Durations measured in minutes instead of seconds, distances in miles instead of paces. The engine, fussed into reliability that belonged to the patient, held its tune. The propellers kept their promises and learned to forgive the occasional rude gust. Once, Wilbur strung together a flight of 39 minutes that turned the prairie into a chalkboard of arcs, each one an insistence that the sky could be used like a road if you asked properly. The patents moved forward with the same mixture of humility and ferocity the brothers brought to the shed. Claims were carved as carefully as propeller edges, control surfaces, warp-rudder coupling, arrangements that turned the problem into something law could measure. Lawyers in stiff collars debated language with a dryness that would have killed other men. The brothers answered with drawings and, when necessary, with a demonstration that ended most arguments politely. Meanwhile, Langley's grand aerodrome had tried to fling itself off a houseboat on the Potomac and had found the river an uncompromising editor. The photographs that traveled east and west put a dent in the country's appetite for aerial claims. It made the Wrights' decision to work in proof, over and over at Huffman Prairie, feel wiser than any press conference could have. "We're not trying to be first in the papers," Orville told a visitor, who was kind enough to ask, but impatient enough to frown. "We're trying to be last in the corrections." By the end of 1905, the Prairie had watched them knit together what the world would soon call a practical flying machine. Takeoff, aided yes by a simple tower and gravity's reliable favor. Turns that were not accidents, but decisions. Landings that earned applause by nobody but the men responsible, and that was just as well. They could stay aloft as long as fuel and pilot sense allowed, shepherding the angle and speed the way a farmer minds a team. Nothing theatrical, everything exact. One evening, after a run that had left the whole field humming with the aftersound of propellers, the brothers sat on the tail of the flyer and looked at the tower in silhouette. The weight box hung still and square. The prairie smelled like cut hay and oil. "We're beyond the question," Wilbur said quietly. "Now comes the world." Orville nodded. The ledger would need new columns, demonstrations, contracts, arguments with governments that spoke different languages than wind and wood. The day slid into a Midwest dusk, kind and blue. A neighbor's lantern winked to life across the field. The brothers stood, brushed dust from their sleeves, and began to pack tools the way a ritual ends, with gratitude and a faint, private smile. They had flown circles over a skepticism that, if not defeated, had at least been given something respectable to eat. The prairie, once a mere field, had become a witness, and a witness, once convinced, is the start of a story that leaves town.
Reduce noise. Huffman Prairie had taught the flyer to behave like a citizen of the air. Now the brothers had to teach the world to believe what a quiet field already knew. Paperwork first, as always. In 1906, the Patent Office stamped their claims with a number and a date, giving legal language to what the wind had taught them. Coordinated control through wing warping and a movable vertical surface, turns that made sense, pitch that stayed honest, and a machine that could be steered instead of merely survived. It wasn't poetry, but it was protection. And in a century just learning to adore invention, protection mattered. Then came the demonstrations that would move belief from rumor to headline. In 1908, the U.S. Army Signal Corps wanted proof. Fort Myer, Virginia, well-dressed officers, skeptical engineers, and a parade ground that preferred parades to experiments. Orville arrived with a flyer tuned by years, not weeks. The first exhibitions were clean, even gracious. Circles over the field, measured climbs, landings that ended where they were meant to. The crowd cheered like people who had finally seen an idea with their own eyes. And then the air reminded everyone that progress keeps a ledger. A cracked propeller, a subtle vibration, an invisible insult to a bearing. On a late flight, a structural failure tore the day in two. The machine fell hard. Orville would survive with injuries that tattooed his memory. Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, his passenger, did not. The nation mourned a bright life lost. The brothers, who had always counted safety as part of success, carried the sorrow like a weight that could never be balanced. They rebuilt with stern humility, not bravado, and Orville returned to the work as soon as bone and spirit allowed. Stubborn, yes, but in the honorable sense. Across the Atlantic, Wilbur set up in Le Mans, France, where the public loved a spectacle and demanded a standard. Skeptics arrived with folded arms. He answered them not with rhetoric, but with a takeoff that wrote a clean sentence across the evening. He banked into a turn so steady that hats lifted and stayed lifted. Figure eights followed, smooth enough to make a clock nod. With every circle completed and every landing dignified, the crowd's noise changed key. From curiosity to conviction, from can he to of course he can. Journalists lost their metaphors and settled for numbers. Minutes aloft turned to hours, altitudes climbed from guesses to measurements. Pilots in waiting, Blériot, Farman, and a generation of restless tinkerers watched a grammar of flight laid out like a map. Catherine joined Wilbur in Europe, steadying the press calls, translating between politeness and practicality, and earning from the French a warmth that astonished even her brothers. When a mayor gave the family a ceremonial ribbon, she smiled and, without fuss, made sure the next day's fuel was still delivered on time.
Contracts followed belief. The U.S. Army took delivery of a machine that met a clause-by-clause test: speed over a set distance, payload without complaint, landings a commander could trust, and, most precious, control as repeatable as a drill. In France, a syndicate put signatures on paper that brought francs, hangers, and a wider family of craftsmen who could read a drawing and make it breathe. In 1909, Wilbur threaded Manhattan's harbor air and circled the Statue of Liberty, a figure eight of gratitude around a gift that meant beginnings. Cameras winked, ferries slowed. New York, which admires only what works, admired. The Wright Company took shape: factories, instructors, a ledger that now counted payrolls and contracts along with angles of attack. The first generation of students learned not just how to handle a gust, but how to talk about it with the calm of a carpenter. The lawsuits with competitors arrived, as they always do, when an idea becomes a foundation. The brothers fought hard to defend the principle they had paid for in sand and patience. They weren't trying to own the sky. They were trying not to let the sky be owned by shortcuts. There were triumphs that felt like the prairie grown wide, sustained flights measured in miles, cross-country hops that made maps seem smaller, and crowds that gathered not to argue but to congratulate. There were costs as well. Wilbur, the austere half of the equation, was taken by typhoid in 1912, and the silence that followed his passing sounded like wind over a field where a master no longer walks. Orville carried the work forward, testing, advising, arguing for safety until argument was no longer necessary. Catherine married late and well, and even that joy stirred an ache in Orville that time eventually softened. Progress is generous in public and personal in private. It pays its debts in mixed coin. What remains,
Beyond the photographs of muslin wings and men in caps squinting into a cold horizon is a way of working that refuses to age. Start small, measure honestly, correct without drama, and treat control as the first morality of any machine. The Wrights did not discover magic. They discovered how respectful attention turns air into an ally. They taught a world used to steam and steel that the sky, too, can be negotiated with if you speak its language in numbers and patience. If you stand today on the dunes at Kill Devil Hills, the wind still keeps office hours. It tastes of salt and history. You can look down the slope and imagine a rail, a dolly, a man on his belly listening with his hands. You can see the short hop that first tilted the world and the long arcs that followed at a prairie that never asked for applause. And if you listen hard enough, over the rush of surf and the hiss of grass, you might hear what the brothers heard, not destiny, not applause, just the next small correction that keeps a good line true.
They were bicycle men in a century of bolder labels. And maybe that is the point. A bicycle teaches balance, the grace of forward motion, and the quiet warning that attention is freedom. They took that lesson and wrote it in air. The rest of us learned to read. Thanks for spending this hour with us. If you enjoyed the Wright Brothers, please like, subscribe, and share. Drop your thoughts or the next topic you want to hear in the comments. We really do read them. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of deep dive storytelling, please subscribe. Next time, we'll bring you another interesting topic we know you'll love. Until then, stay curious and keep your eyes on the horizon.